Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to my Dean's Forum in May. Um, my name is Jodi Sandfort, and I have the great privilege of being the dean here at the Evans School and have been hosting this Dean's Forum for over 5 years because I really believe that one of the roles of public universities is to talk about important issues and really provide some context and sense making to help us make sense of current events. There's a lot of things that are going on and claiming our attention. And today we're going to have a conversation really around the convergence between the changing media landscape and important issue like climate change, and how, if we aren't running a nation, if we aren't part of the UN, can we be part of a solution at the community level to responding effectively to a big complex problem like climate change? So as the screen suggests, this webinar is being recorded, and we're going to have an interactive discussion, capture ideas from the panelists around resources that they could provide to ongoing learning. A critical part of this forum has always been questions and answers. So please put questions and answers in the chat. We're going to be integrating those questions as we go. So I'd like to invite my panelists to join me. We have a great group today. And my conversation or the session was really influenced by conversations that I had with Professor Adrienne Russel about democratic responses to climate change, and the fact that as the traditional media sources have been shifting, it's harder for people to know what's actually going on and relevant in their local place. And then on top of that, we have all of these shifts in the federal government. And so I really wanted us to have the conversation today because we all have agency. We all have things we can do. We just need to talk to some experts who are doing that work in real time. Because at the Evans School, what we like to do is talk with our students and others about what is real, what's really happening. We need to learn about it, and then to think about how do we creatively address what is, so that we can be better at creating a better reality for ourselves. So what I'd love to do at the start of this conversation is to invite each of you wonderful panelists to share a bit about yourself, your work, and why are you motivated to be in this work? And Lucky, why don't we begin with you?
Talofa, thank you so much for having me today, and happy AAPI month, everybody. So my name is Lagipoiva Cherelle Jackson. I am a Samoan Indigenous climate journalist, and I am currently serving as Professor of Pacific Island Studies at Portland State University. I continue to report internationally on Pacific Island issues, specifically on climate change and Indigenous issues and human rights facing Pacific Island countries. What motivates me, Jodi? Well, I was born on a small island in Samoa. It was an outer island. And when I was growing up, there was no media on our island. And all the news we heard on the radio was about the town area or other islands in the Pacific. So I always felt it was unfair as a child that I didn't hear what was happening on our island. So my motivation was really just to tell the stories of underserved communities, in this case, the island I grew up in. Again, thank you so much for having me today.
Adrienne.
Hi, yeah. Thank you so much for assembling this conversation, Jodi. I'm really excited to be able to talk with you about these issues. So my name is Adrienne Russel. I'm a professor in the Department of Communication at UW, and I am the co-director of the Center for Media, Journalism, and Democracy. And my I have studied the intersection of the sort of information landscape and the climate crisis for quite a long time. And my motivation is really, I'm very interested in power dynamics in communication environments and the ways that, various information gets floated to the top much more readily than others. And I think that there's an increase in this happening, and also a decrease in the visibility of how this works. So those are the motivations of my current work, and I'm excited to be able to have this conversation about those aspects of it here.
And James.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here. Thank you, Dean Sanford, for the invitation as well. My name is James Lee. I'm the communications advocacy strategist with Front and Centered. We are a statewide nonprofit of about 60 community-based organizations around the state working to advance environmental and climate justice. And my motivation for this work really stems from where I come from. My hometown in the Silicon Valley of the Bay Area has had an issue for decades with wetlands and with folks wanting to develop the wetlands and pave them over. In 2012, I was part of a movement that organized in my hometown to stop the development of these wetlands, and I entered that uh, issue as an environmentalist, as someone who was interested in marine science. And it was really my first lesson in environmental justice because it was what got me out into the rest of my community, meeting folks who did not look like me, who had other priorities than me. And we really came together to stop what seemed like a juggernaut that we couldn't possibly stop. And it's informed my work ever since. So happy to be here.
Great. Well, part of what we're trying to talk about today is really the media's role in helping communities understand what's going on and not feel helpless, but feel like they can do something in light of this complex problem. So, Adrienne, can you, from your academic perspective, kind of lay out some of the facts, both about climate and about the media?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think most important for this conversation is to start with a thing that most of us, I think, who are listening or showing up here today know, which is that the temperatures are warming due to human caused conditions, and climate change is resulting in extreme weather, extreme health challenges, extreme and new health challenges in many cases, and changes in ecosystems. And this is scientific fact. And so we tend to think of this as a scientific issue, but actually, once and now that it has been established as scientific fact, it really depends on what we collectively want to do about it. And so, in my way of thinking about it, because I'm a communication scholar, this puts it centrally in the realm of being a communication problem. So that is what I think is so important about looking at how we sort of sort out collectively our values and then decide what to do about these issues. And that's also why it's important to look critically at our information environment. I mean, Jodi, when you say media, it means so many things to different people, and that's like the start of both the problem and the solution. And so I think in some ways we're in this environment today where we have more access to more and better information and more channels to get diverse and voices with different expertise out there. But at the same time, it's one of the most controlled and unequal communication environments we've ever experienced. We have billions of dollars being poured in to messaging from the fossil fuel industry. We have algorithms, sorting us into groups and micro-targeting messages. We have, extreme and emotional content, getting far more play than the more boring but fact-based content. So these are the issues that I think, like, James, myself, and Cherelle are all kind of addressing in our different avenues of work. And so that's what I'm hoping we can sort of tease out in this conversation.
Luggy, anything that is just triggered as you listen to Adrienne and reflect on your kind of understanding of this moment that we're at in relation to people trying to take this scientific fact and interpret it in this very dense environment of media and information.
Thank you, Dean Sanford. I think this is, it's always exciting for me as a climate journalism nerd to discuss these issues. What really sticks out for me in what you're saying, and also what Dr. Russell has referenced, is that this need or desire by the public or readers or our audiences to understand what they can do, to let go of this feeling of helplessness. This need has only just arrived in the US in more recent years. I've done most of my reporting in my home country, in my native language of Samoan, and Pacific Island journalists have covered these issues for many, many years. And our communities, the communities that we report on, they did the least to contribute to the problem. If you look at the numbers right now and the contributions of emissions by Pacific Island country, it amounts to 0.03% of total emissions. And yet these are the very people who are on the front lines of the climate crisis. So when you ask this question of what can people do? They feel helpless. That is primarily an issue that is very much within Western nations and high emitting nations. And you're seeing that in the US. And it's very admirable to see a lot of our readers and communities, just from a journalism perspective, in the US expressing that desire. But we shouldn't also negate the fact that it took storms, it took floods, it took fires, it took extreme weather events to hit those with the largest pockets and those with the wealthiest, with the largest homes and some of the wealthiest cities to actually hit home for countries like the US, to hit home that this is actually a problem. But in the global south and developing countries, people have been experiencing this for years and years and years, and we've been reporting on it. So I think this is such a great topic to discuss, but also just to note the fact that there is a disparity here in terms of the Americans' understanding of the climate crisis and also just how we in the global south have been experiencing it the whole time.
I really appreciate that perspective, and it gets to some of the things that Adrienne framed up from her analysis about power and resources being a significant driver in people's understanding of the problem and the resources dedicated to documenting it and being in discussion across difference. James, how do you make sense of how people are looking at the same facts and about the problem of climate change and how their interpretations of those facts diverge?
Yeah, I think for us for me personally, but also for us as front-centered, as representatives of frontline communities, one of the things we always think about is that there are multiple knowledge sources, right? There's traditional Western science, there's also indigenous knowledge. There are different ways of knowing and different lived experiences. So it's okay to have different realities if they're coming from good faith and if they're coming backed by critical analysis. But the problem here is that we know that there is a huge other reality that is being purposely created by folks who are very much invested in uh, not confronting climate change and not dealing with the problem because not dealing with the problem makes them a lot of money. And so understanding that, we have this different, uh, again, power dynamic where some folks have different perspectives, but it's a certain perspective that's being uplifted right now. And that takes up a lot of the media and narrative oxygen that is in a society. That's something that we need to be aware of and be cognizant that that's what we're up against. For us at Front and Center, and for me, my personal ethos as a communicator, I really try to uplift the voices that aren't being heard. So, how do we navigate this reality of people looking at facts a different way? It's really trying to get the voices of our communities out there and really trying to show, well, what do our communities, how do they experience these facts on the ground? We know that, global temperature is rising. We know that there are all sorts of different climate impacts related to that, but for people in their communities, for their families, what does that mean? Whether it's rising energy costs, um, air that's becoming dirtier, water that's less clean. These are all things that affect people and affect people's lives. And when you break it down to that sort of human level, I think there's a lot of commonality to be found and a lot of empathy that can be communicated or promoted across different viewpoints and realities.
One of the Dean's forums that I had in the past was actually looking at the Infrastructure Reduction Act in the United States government that actually was a transformational climate investment. It provided the Environmental Protection Agency here with $41 billion to really both combat climate change, reduce pollution, the kinds of pollution that we know is targeted in this country towards some of the communities, James, that you're talking about. And it was the first time in national law we had had a focus on environmental justice. And so I had people from the EPA and people who were trying to move an environmental justice agenda through. And now we're in a very different reality, right? A lot of those provisions were halted. There were some implementation challenges with some of those investments. And you have executive branch, right, that is denying the existence of climate change. And so I'm curious, do you all just see this as politics, or is there a deeper analysis that you would offer to kind of, when I think of Lucky's point that in many places in the world, this topic has been one that you can't ignore. How do you understand this, what really is almost an extreme flip in the United States from just a few years ago to where we are today? Adrienne, what do you tell your students about these things?
Well, I don't think we can ignore it in the United States either anymore. So, I mean, I think that what is dawning on people in this country very far behind the rest of the world is that fires are coming to their, part of town. And, these extreme weather, these health conditions are happening to them as well. So, I mean, the question of whether it's just politics or, what's happening right now, I think that the question is about values again. It's like this is happening, and I think that whatever quibbles people may have with the science in the political realm, we are feeling the actual impacts of the climate crisis. I don't think when I talk to students and I ask them, has anyone, like what are the ways that you've experienced this? 5, 10 years ago, maybe, a handful of people would say how they've experienced it. Now, if you live in Washington, if you live in Seattle, there's fire season. If you live in California, which a lot of our students do, there's fire season and all sorts of other stuff. So the impacts are here. The resources being pulled from addressing it are both political, but they're also about a contest of values that we're going through in this country. And, those values are about who deserves health, who deserves safety, who deserves, a good life. And so I think that that's at its core the question that's on the table, or the question that's being put on the table, rather than the assumption that we are going to do something about it and everybody deserves health and safety. So my way of thinking of it is we're just asking the wrong questions, but we'll get back to the right questions.
And so in your mind, the right questions are centering these conflicting values?
No, the right question is, what are we going to do about this to protect the most amount of people and the most amount of the ecosystem? That would be the right question.
Mhm. Well, so all of you come with an expertise in communications and media studies. And so I'm curious, in the different domains of that, how has the reporting, the storytelling, the platforms of sharing information, how has that changed in the last 5 years? So, Lucky, you spent some time in newsrooms. How is that altered?
uh, dramatically, Dean Sanford. So, in the fa past 5 years, I've held roles with the Associated Press. I continue to report for The Guardian. I've been reporting at the local level. I also report on issues with the BBC. So it's both international and national here in the US, and then very much localized in the Pacific Islands. There has been a tremendous difference in the way that climate has been reported in the past 10 years, past 5 years, and then the past year alone. You've seen
Mhm.
this huge shift. And then there's also a shift internationally, not so much, but more nationally in the US, given what James has mentioned and given what Dr. Russell has also mentioned in terms of the political shifts in this country. So I'll speak first to the US, the shift here. You see the shift because of the changes in funding, and you see the shift in because of the pressures in newsrooms to maintain certain funding and to appeal to certain philanthropic financing. That is a very much a silent conversation in terms of how the news is being influenced right now, in terms of how climate is being reported. Climate has never been a sexy topic. It's not the topic that sells the newspapers. And if it sells the newspapers, it's because it's being reported on in the wrong way. It's being sensationalized. If climate is reported as a human interest story, as a science story, an indigenous story, a community-based story, it doesn't necessarily cause all the clicks or, sells the newspapers. So newsrooms have had to be creative in the way that the science is reported. And let's be honest, climate news in this country is very much reporting to the converted. And that's fundamentally the flaw of news, the way that the US media reports on the news. When you are reporting to the converted, they already understand this issue. It's the communities that are highly affected and that are on the front lines of the climate crisis in the US. Those of lower socioeconomic statuses, immigrant communities, communities who are on the other side of the political spectrum. They are not necessarily the climate stories are not being reported in a way that not appeals to them, but actually touches their communities. I'm talking about farmers, hunting. I'm talking about communities that rely on the land. And climate stories far outweigh and it reaches far beyond political borders. And so I'll now pivot to the way that climate has been reported internationally. Internationally, nothing has changed. If anything, climate reporting has increased in a very positive way, and it has I speak on the Guardian's coverage. Say, for instance, at the Guardian, I have been, increasing the way that climate is reported in the Pacific, and those stories, range from the impact on weaving, the impact on traditional practices, the impact on plants that sustain cultures, the impact on cultural practices. And then, in addition to that, also the resilient nature of the Pacific peoples and how people are building their community so that it is resilient, community-based adaptation measures, mitigation at a national level. So things that are being tried and tested in smaller island countries, and then also the presence of smaller island countries and developing countries in international negotiations. So when you ask this question of how has climate coverage shifted in the past 5 years, you can view it in two ways. One, internationally, climate coverage has continued, if not increased, and it has become more nuanced and more comprehensive for many international media outlets. What you're also seeing is countries so say, for instance, in the Philippines, Indonesia, you also have Caribbean nations, so you have Kenya. You have these countries where journalists are now specializing in climate change and are reporting from their own indigenous communities. This is so important for indigenous journalism, but also the coverage of climate change itself. In terms of the US, you know the challenges here. The challenges here, any any funding cuts to newsrooms, any advertising shifts impacts the way that the news is made and impacts, and the first cuts go to the nuanced coverage. And the nuanced coverage and the first cuts usually are the environmental journalists, the climate journalists, and the news beats that serve a very niche market or a very niche audience. So there's certainly different shifts, Dane Sanford. I want to say that internationally, what you've also noticed internationally is a more kind of concentrated coverage and an analysis of the US contribution to the climate crisis due to the political shifts. And that has actually been a very interesting shift, and it's been very educational and informative as well, just to see the just the complexity of the US decision-making process and political presence on the climate crisis itself internationally.
There's so much you've said here. So I'm gonna come back to you because my brain is just blinking. But one of the questions we've got, which from the audience, which informs these next questions, is just because of the media, right, is so decentralized, and that we don't often, you've just spoken about the newsrooms. I'm wondering, before we leave these questions, how have things changed in the last 5 years? We know that isn't where only the news is coming from, right? So, James, the way nonprofits have been talking about climate change, how has that shifted in the last 5 years?
Yeah, there's definitely been a shift too, similarly related in part due to the current federal administration. But we know for a fact that, there's a lot of federal funding prior to 2025 that just does not exist anymore for environmental work, especially environmental justice work. Nonprofits have been specifically targeted by this administration as being un-American, and EJ has been equated to DEI, which is another buzzword that's being used to demonize really important initiatives. And so the reaction in the nonprofit space, there's two ways to go, right? It's either to, essentially, for lack of a better term, go with the flow and change how we're talking about the work that we're doing, and not using terms like EJ or DEI or social justice. But the other strategy, of course, is to double down and say, hey, this is what we do. And obviously, changing our words now isn't going to change our entire, 10 or 5 year or however long history as a nonprofit. So nonprofits are taking a different tack, but what is affecting nonprofits across the board is that pulling back of funding. All nonprofits have felt it. Certainly, we've felt it. And it's not just at the federal level, it's at the state level as well. And the thing about the decrease in funding, it's not just that it's less dollars, but in the media narrative, I think what that what that pulling back of funding also reflects, in synchronized with in sort of synchrony with the media landscape, is that right now climate is seen as like a luxury or like a different issue, like to think about above. That's like climate is something you need to have time for. It's not a quote unquote bread and butter issue like affordability or housing. And I think that framing really misses the mark, because climate affects everything from our energy bill to the water we drink or the water we won't have to drink, maybe in the near future, or the air that we breathe. And so I think the framing or this idea that climate is not a bread and butter issue really affects the way that organizations that deal with environmental justice or with climate change impacts function. And that's a communications challenge that we need to overcome, that to point out that like actually, climate change is about the planet. So this is a planetary issue. So all issues are affected, including our day-to-day lives and whether we can put food on the table or not.
So, Adrienne, same question to you. You mentioned in your introduction that you run the Center for Media Journalism and Democracy. So I know you've been thinking a lot about both the online environment and the way these topics are understood and communicated within the academy. So how has it changed in the last 5 years?
Well, I would say those two entities have changed in completely different directions. So within the academy, I see there's so many more people integrating the issue of climate into their curriculum, and also like climate communication within our field has become much more of something that people are researching, are studying, are understanding as like one of the central um, places to understand what's happening in our communication environment, but also one of the most pressing problems we have to deal with. So, just like in professional conferences or just among my colleagues, the people who are learning about and teaching and focusing their research on this has really bloomed in the last 5 years. And then in the online environment, I would say in the last 5 years, and almost exactly the last 5 years, it has gotten much more toxic. And it was already pretty toxic, the communication environment around climate issues. So I'll just give Twitter as an example. Twitter used to be a place that climate journalists and climate scientists and climate advocates really came together and had this like sort of ideal, healthy exchange. Sure, there was a lot of vitriol and pushback against especially climate scientists online, but there was also these like sort of communities within platforms like Twitter where there was a really dynamic exchange of ideas and information globally, I would say. But in the last 5 years, since Musk took over Twitter, they have gotten rid of content moderation. They have completely shifted their idea of what protections should be, afforded people who use their platform. And this is happening across platforms, by the way. This is also happening on Facebook and Instagram and TikTok. So platforms are following the politics of the White House and other sort of places where extremism is getting a lot of mainstream play. And so it's much more dangerous and fraught to be somebody talking about climate communication online these days, which is a major loss to these discussions because if you're a journalist who doesn't have access in any other way to the latest information except for via social media, and the person who's posting it on social media is getting death threats, then your flow of information is getting interrupted in a very practical way. So again, there's like an increase in sort of academic interest beyond the sciences that I think is really positive. And then in the online environment, it's what Cory Doctorow calls the enshittification. And it has happened here solidly and squarely and as like a sort of exemplary like model for what is happening with every aspect of the internet.
What I'm taking from what each of you said is that there's something fundamental here about people understanding or not climate change as a central defining component of life. And that when you're in the Pacific Islands, that is irrefutable. Here in this big continent of North America, it is also irrefutable. And yet this is where I'm hearing you all say that the way money shapes newsrooms, shapes investment in civil society, shapes the nature of the virtual space, that is significantly interfering in everyday people's understanding about, is this a problem worth attention and worrying about? I mean, James, I really appreciated both what you and Lagi said about oftentimes the reporting is only towards people who are already converted. I think, Lagi, that's what you said. And James, like the organizations that see this as their mission. And yet I'm hearing underneath all of you, the scientific fact of this should actually be indisputable. But there's a disconnect between the frame of that understanding and what we're seeing in the media space. Is that a way to integrate what you've all offered?
Yeah, I think that's really well put. It's money. That's the problem.
Is it just money?
I mean, there's
Well,
also self-censorship, as Dr. Russell has mentioned, right?
Self-censorship because of concerns about the ramifications of sharing factual information or sharing strategies or tactics designed to mobilize people to respond to the concern. Is that
Adrienne, is that an accurate, like with that, I feel like certain journalists are certainly not, there is some fear there, which results in either a pivot from coverage or refraining from addressing the issue that is at hand?
I mean, I've done interviews with journalists on this very matter, and I think it really, I mean, it ebbs and flows according to like f funding models and according to politics. But I know that a lot, what has happened in the space just recently, I guess in the last 5 years, but especially in the last year, is a lot of media outlets like Grist that covers climate issues. But also there's a lot of philanthropically run news outlets that are climate focused that have gotten cut funding because of from the government and investment in like the circulation of scientific information, but also in terms of philanthropic organizations that give them money that have said, okay, now we actually have to give our money to other things because there's so many things on the table that are getting slashed right now, like immigration and various other things. So I think there's just like a thinning of money towards journalism, climate journalism, that has intensified in the last year. But I mean, yeah, I think it's about money, but it's also about this this tendency in the United States to give some sort of credence to the idea that some people deserve better conditions than others, which, money's a shortcut way of saying that. But I guess the reality is that there we are functioning in a way that privileges certain people at the disadvantage of others, always in every realm. So, I think that's the longer way of saying, yeah, it's about money.
oh, and yeah, Lucky in her examples from Samoa. Well, a few things. I'm gonna go with the Samoa thing. Well, because when you were talking about the coverage that you can see, that it's both showing the implications of climate change in many dimensions of everyday life. And you shared that part of the stories that are shared are about ways of being resilient. And so part of what I feel like as not a climate scientist, this whole topic feels overwhelming. So if you can't offer these stories of resilience, I think it does mean that you end up only talking to the people who already prioritize this as a topic. But Lovey, it sounds like you have seen some things that really work to make this topic real in a very personal way. Is that accurate?
Very much so. I think, I've reported on communities and Indigenous Pacific Island scientists who are working on finding the best taro that is drought resistant, right? I've reported on communities who developed ways to still be able to grow root crops with saltwater inundation. I've worked with fishermen who have developed, and through village councils, I reported on them, who have developed a very effective dynamic marine protected area systems at the coastal areas so that they can preserve their own coastal areas, so that they can sustain the fisheries resources available to them. And when you look at issues like that, where communities are relying on fisheries, it's not just about the food that they eat. The fish also means this is livelihoods, right? They're selling the fish so that they can not only feed the village, but also sell so they can educate the son and the daughter, so they can move into another, into other income earning opportunities. So you're not only climate change doesn't only impact the direct food systems, but also the livelihoods, and by way of that, rights to education, health, and economic improvement for many villages. I've seen how these resilient measures are explored and also demonstrated by those at the front lines with very little resources. So the way that I have covered these issues in the Pacific is really to lean into Indigenous resilient measures, adaptation measures that are founded on ancestral knowledge. And for a very long time, when we talk about climate or the impact of climate crisis, we refer to the Western scientists, or we refer to the Western science and what will happen. And we tend to miss out on those nuanced stories on the ground. So, to answer your question, I've seen these amazing resilient measures happen on the ground. And, I've been covering the Pacific now for 45 years, climate for 45, sorry, for 25 years. I'm not that old.
I was
Thank you
going to
very
say, my
much.
goodness.
My goodness. I mean, I started when I was 10. No. So for 20 years, I've been reporting on the Pacific. And at the beginning of that, no one else was covering this story. I was the only Samoan journalist covering climate. And that was very interesting to convince the Samoan editors that I was going to cover something that the Western science had said, hey, this is happening. But I've seen a shift, right? So on the islands, I've seen a shift from people's understanding of the climate crisis as something that was created by the West to something that is now impacting us.
Mm.
And I'm seeing that shift here. What is unfortunate is that due to the political crisis in this country, we had made so much advancement, internationally and also nationally to report on these issues, but there's now a regression, so to speak. There's a pause almost, as it pivots to the political aspect of it. But at the same time, there's amazing journalists who continue to cover communities, diaspora communities in the US, and who are doing really important work. And there's also nonprofits who continue to support the media to make sure that those stories are told. A good example of this in the US is you look at the Maui fires. I'm just going to speak on like the differences in the way that the US media covers climate. You look at the Maui fires and then you look at the LA fires. Um, just run the numbers on the two types of coverage, and you'll see that the LA fires received a lot more coverage, a lot longer coverage, more nuance, more money was put into the coverage of that crisis than the Maui fires by the newsrooms. The Maui fires were covered, were not necessarily covered in a community-based way, and it was not considerate of the nuances of the Maui story itself. And I think if you look at climate coverage in the US, and I'm going off on a little bit of a tangent here, Dean Sanford, but if you look at the way that climate is communicated or is covered in the media here, that's a really good case study. You have an island, it is a US state, but it is a Polynesian, and these are indigenous Polynesian people with a very complex colonial history. And then you have the LA fires with some of the richest, most wealthiest people in this country. You just have to read the coverage to understand that money plays a big role in the way that the US media covers stories. But more importantly, the media responds to what the audiences tend to desire and tend to click on. And those two cases definitely had very different response mechanisms. I'm sure Dr. Russell has analyzed some of this and may be able to comment more on the audience responses, but it is a good example of the type of climate coverage that the US media engages in, depending on the types of communities involved.
You've said so many things that are really interesting to me. Adrienne, do you want to respond at all to what she's just said before I highlight some other things?
I mean, only just a second, I think it's a really good example, the comparison. I think one thing that's worth mentioning now that we've brought up crisis communication is that, it's super interesting in both cases of the LA fire and the Maui fires. one of the biggest challenges was getting people safe because there is so much misinformation spreading, but also that people don't trust information coming from FEMA and other official sources anymore. So it's not just like tapping down misinformation, but it's the erosion of trust in institutions that are meant to help people that actually ends up causing much more harm to both people and property. And I use this one clip in a presentation I often give of the coverage of the Maui fires where the mayor gets on and is making appeals to people to stop like spreading misinformation about FEMA workers. And then they refer to like a local rapper and influencer, and he's interviewed on the news telling people, stop spreading misinformation. So like the sort of circumvention of the authority, and then the authority pointing to the people actually trust is like such an interesting and very typical, I think, today circulation of how trust is being built and undermined.
As we're talking, I am moving back and forth between a lot of despair and some hope. So I wonder, in this kind of narrative, and this is a question that comes from the audience, of climate doomism, right? And the way that these extreme climate events make it so that none of us can do anything. I'm hearing some ways in international contexts where you can make people realize that there is hope, that there is an idea of resilience. They can be engaged. James, do you see your nonprofit partners doing any of that, trying to highlight those stories so that they can be picked up and magnified?
Yeah, I do see that happening, within as, capacity and funding allows, which is usually the big challenge for most nonprofits in telling these stories, because it requires a bit more extra work than the day-to-day communications that happens in nonprofits. But yeah, I think to the point of the question, I think that's really important that we share stories of what communities on the ground are doing because there are published studies that show, if you just talk about the doom and gloom of climate change, it literally disempowers people. It encourages them to turn off, to stop scrolling that thing on their phone, to look away. And also, especially for frontline communities, which that's my shorthand for communities of color, Indigenous folks, anyone who is hit first and worst by climate change impacts. For frontline communities, when we see that kind of narrative about how climate change is affecting our communities and we're painted as victims and vulnerable, it's a very disempowering narrative. And what really helps folks, especially folks in frontline communities, to engage, to feel empowered, to take action, is to see other examples of here's what people are doing to combat climate change. Because as Lagi was referring to earlier at the beginning of our talk today, climate change is not new for Indigenous folks, for a lot of colonized folks, or for folks in the global South. Even here in the lower 48, there's the old meme of like, oh, could you imagine your entire climate and landscape changing within your lifetime? And Indigenous folks who are displaced from their lands to reservations have experienced that actually. And so folks have been dealing with climate change for a long time. And I think to me, it's not so much about hope, but it's about looking towards the people who have been facing that problem and working to deal with that problem and keep their communities resilient in spite of all that. And when you look to those folks and when you look to those solutions, that's where a lot of inspiration and motivation to take action could really come from, I feel, in my opinion.
Although one of the things I'd say is, Lucky, in your comments, you talked about farmers in the United States or hunters. My dad is a hunter. Midwest, grew up doing that. And I watch him, he's a white guy in his mid-80s, trying to make sense of climate change. And I think, like the people you talk about reporting on yourself, he's concerned. He can see how the landscape is changing, how the weather is more volatile in rural Wisconsin. But because the media has not, the traditional media, given his age, hasn't framed up a clear problem or solution, it is literally like his brain doesn't know how to process the thing that from his lived experience he knows is different than 70 years ago. And so I guess I wonder, have you seen any of you kind of coalitions with these groups of people that farmers also, right, know that there's a different climate environment, but that there's some disconnect between being able to take that sense of dread and mobilize it into a political force to address some of these concerns about legitimation and money that you're all talking about.
I really appreciate that example. And um, when you talk about your father and what he's seeing, right? That is the experience of fishermen. That's the experience of, if you look, hunters and gatherers across Indigenous communities in the world. So rural America is no different.
Right.
And I always find it, I've spoken at conferences where journalists are like, how do we report to them? Or, that otherism due to the political divide, and yet everyone experiences climate. And those who don't know experience it in the most traumatizing way because they can't explain why these things are changing. And I have experienced, and you describe it so aptly, because I've seen this with chiefs and fishermen and communities in the Pacific, where it's like, wait, I used to go out there. So a fisherman I interviewed 2 years ago on the southern side of the island I'm from, he used to go out for an hour, and he's a spear fisherman. He could dive down for about 15 to 20 meters. And he will only need to go down for about 30 minutes, 15 to 30 minutes, and he's done for the day. He's like, I'm getting, at least 25, sometimes up to like 35 fish on his spear. Now he's lucky he has to dive at least 3 or 4 times and spend about 3 hours out there in order to get a catch. So to him, it's like, I don't understand. And that kind of feeling where he just doesn't know what to place it on, is very, it's a very emotional thing for a journalist to see, because you're covering these communities. This is what they've always known, and now it's changed. So a very interesting thing I found myself in is translating the science to the person that I am interviewing, so they can give me their view on what is happening if it aligns with the shifts they see. And often what I've seen is almost this light, like, oh, okay, well, that explains it because I haven't done anything different. Right. So to him, he's spending the same amount of time going out there. He's going to the same locations, but things have changed around him. So in terms of the role of the communicator and of the journalist, the journalist also needs to take on a piece of that translation, of translating the science, so that the people that we report on, or the people who are we interviewing, can accurately understand climate and its impacts before they can give us an informed opinion, or rather frame it within the climate crisis. So it has been one of the most educational, also enjoyable parts of my job in reporting on Indigenous communities, is to really relay that science as a journalist. And knowledge is a privilege. And to be able to not only translate the science, but translate it in my own language has been an absolute privilege to do. But at the same time, I also then get to learn about the way that communities who are facing these, problems first and worst are going through it in ways that my colleagues in the West who don't speak my language don't get to understand. So the layered aspect of that is the more journalists who speak Indigenous languages and languages of the global South, the more we report on our communities, the more we realize that one, there are problems that we've never really reported on as a result of the climate crisis, but two, there are solutions and adaptation measures that these communities have developed over time that, that also needs translation and also will benefit from some coverage. So to just tie it back to your story of your father, I've spoken to some amazing farmers and hunters in this country, hunters who hunt for food. And when your food systems and your food sources are interrupted, that's a story. And these stories are not covered enough. The impact of war, the impact of decisions to smaller town, to rural America is so important. And we're seeing a pivot nationally in the national news media back to the local newsrooms. And I think that is the greatest thing to have occurred in the past 5 years is the return to the local newsroom, the prioritization of the local newsroom. But thank you so much for sharing that story of your dad.
Well, I'm learning from you in this conversation that I actually feel like there's a piece there around building um, power and community understanding by people have these questions, but in this country, there's a lack of responding to connect it to the bigger piece, and people just get stuck in this doom. Or we've talked about so much focus on energy, right, as the problem of the environment, but that there's a much more fundamental driver here. So believe it or not, we are almost at the end of our time. And so just, I think what brought us together was a concern about in this environment, with the politics as they are, with the climate as it is, with the media ecosystem the way it is, how can we help people feel like that they have something they could do, that they can be an agent in this time? And so just in closing, any remarks you would have about that, any resources you would offer to people who want to learn more, books, podcasts, other things. Um, Whoever would like to begin.
Yeah, I love this question because we actually Earth Day was last month, and it's a question we get often on Earth Day. It's like how do I plug in? Where do I even start? I want to start by saying, I think we talked a lot about money, but I do think there is something culturally as well, especially in the US, with our focus on individualism that is a challenge for us because we always think about, well, what can I do, right, as one person? When you think about it that way, it's very overwhelming. So the real question is, what can we do together, right? And so I think when you start to reframe it that way, it's a different question, and to me, that feels like a better question. And I think for me, what I always tell folks is, again, frontline communities, whether that's communities of color or Indigenous folks, we have been working on climate solutions for a long time. And I feel like the best way to get started is don't start from scratch. Support the people who are already doing this work. Join them if you can, amplify their efforts, and see what's already happening on the ground. Um, and I would say, just you could always go to our website, frontandcenter.org, because we just through our materials have a lot of references to a lot of other organizations across Washington State. But I think if you take a look at your own community, wherever that is, whether it's in the state or not, I would say start on the ground and see what groups are in your area already doing this work. I Believe me, they will need your support. They need your support, whether it's financial, whether it's your personal time and capacity. Support is needed now more than ever, and you don't have to start from scratch. There's a community waiting for you to join it.
Mm.
We're out of time, but do you want me to answer?
We've got 1 minute.
Okay, I'll just say quickly that there's an interesting question in the chat about the individual responsibility versus like sort of industry, corporate, governmental responsibility. And I do think it's really important to underscore that like one of the things we can do is put pressure on the actual polluters to, do something. But in terms of individual responsibility or communities coming together, I mean, I think that we all have certain realms where we wield some sort of power. So I think, there's a climate scientist, Catherine Hayhoe, that talks a lot about the best thing that we can do is talk to each other about it and like help each other understand at the level of their values and their life why this matters. And so I think like if you're a teacher, if you work in like advertising, if you are a journalist, if you are, if you have conversations with people every day in a cafe, like these are like any realm where you wield any influence, you can start to exert that influence in the direction of like coming together, like James said, and like figuring out how we can work together to sort of break down these commonsensical things that we live within, that like fossil fuel will always be here and that we have to drive everywhere and that we need stuff delivered to us, within an hour, and all these things that have become like sort of our operating, mode that don't actually need to be that way. And we aren't making choices based on reality when we make those choices. I'll stop.
Augie, last words. Thank you for putting resources in the chat as well.
I think forums like this is very important. I support what Dr. Russell is saying in terms of just talking about it and coming up with ways to address the communication crisis, and also strengthening climate journalism is very important. My last thought is support Indigenous news media, support Indigenous journalism. Anyways, you can find your way to their websites, follow the journalists who are covering issues from their communities. That's the best way you can act as an individual to support the way that climate is being reported, not just at the national level, but internationally. Once again, thank you so much, Dean Sandfort, for your time. And it was great to also share this platform with you, Dr. Russell and James.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us.